Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is simple: to take a stack of sources, articles, research papers, historical texts, and extract the essential high-impact knowledge you need to be truly well-informed.
And today, we are really jumping into the deep end.
We really are. We're undertaking a deep dive into a man who was, in his own time, perhaps the most famous, the wealthiest, and certainly the most politically powerful Stoic philosopher in the entire Roman Empire. Lucius Annaeus Seneca the Younger.
Seneca is absolutely the definition of a high-stakes figure. I mean, you cannot divorce his philosophy from his biography.
Not at all.
Because he wasn't some isolated scholar writing in an ivory tower. He was deep within the viper pit of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, serving as the chief tutor and, for a long time, the advisor to the infamous Emperor Nero.
He was living and working at the absolute pinnacle of power and, I would say, moral danger.
Oh, absolutely.
And that immediately presents the ultimate defining conflict. Our sources give us this truly panoramic view of his impossible life. We've got his origins in Spain, his health crises, his political exile, and of course his eventual forced suicide.
And then there's his monumental body of work, the moral essays, the letters to Lucilius that, essentially define Stoic practice for the West.
Right.
And the dark tragedies, and even some pretty scathing satire.
So our mission today is to cut through all that noise and just the sheer volume of his output.
We need to distill the key insights, really.
Yeah.
How did this philosopher navigate the absolute extremes of his existence? I mean, navigating his staggering fortune while preaching poverty.
Which is the big one.
It's the big one. Surviving political exile under Claudius and counseling the young Nero during his most volatile years.
And above all, we're looking for the profound, practical lessons his writings offer us about ethics, emotion, and dealing with what he called the wounds of life.
And here is the initial intrigue, right? The central paradox that defines his legacy and the challenge we have to confront in this deep dive.
Exactly. Seneca championed Stoicism. He preached the necessity of rational control, the acceptance of fate, the virtue of poverty. And yet, he became an unbelievably rich man, was ruthlessly involved in imperial intrigue, and repeatedly begged for his recall from exile.
So what does this all mean for the sincerity of his philosophy?
That's the question. We're going to unpack this contradiction by first tracing the, what you could only call the political roller coaster of his life.
To contextualize Seneca, you have to start far from the marble halls of Rome. He was born around 4 BC in Colonia, Patricia Corduba, in Hispania Baetica, which is modern-day Spain.
Okay, so he's a provincial, not a native Roman.
Right, but from a prominent family. His father, Seneca the Elder, was already famous as a respected writer and a teacher of rhetoric.
So this environment just steeped Seneca the Younger in the twin disciplines of politics and intellectual achievement from the moment he was born.
He was brought to Rome early on, maybe around age 5, and got the elite education you'd expect for a Roman of his class. The curriculum was all about rhetoric and philosophy.
And our sources highlight 2 key philosophical influences for him, right?
Yes, Attalus the Stoic and a man named Socration.
And Socration was part of a really interesting school of thought.
He was. He belonged to the short-lived but intriguing school of the Sextii, which tried to blend Stoicism, the philosophy of inner resilience and virtue, with elements of Pythagoreanism.
Which was known for its asceticism.
Exactly. And that blending led to a memorable anecdote about his early life. The vegetarian phase.
Ah, yes, the vegetarian phase. We learned that in his early 20s, Socration actually persuaded him to abstain from meat.
And he practiced this strictly for about a year. But what's fascinating is why he stopped.
It wasn't a philosophical crisis, was it?
Not at all. It was pragmatism and political optics. His father worried that the vegetarian practice was too closely associated with some foreign rites.
Meaning non-Roman cults or superstitions.
Precisely. Things that could damage his son's political prospects. So Seneca, always the pragmatist, just stopped.
This early compromise really does set the tone for his adult life.
It does. And his adult life almost ended before it really began, because of his severe ill health. Around 80-20, in his mid-20s, he was suffering from these debilitating breathing difficulties.
Probably asthma.
Probably asthma, yeah, and coupled with tuberculosis. He was seriously ill.
So what did they do?
Given his condition, he was sent to Egypt to live in a warmer, drier climate with his aunt. Her husband, Gaius Galerius, was the prefect of Egypt.
So he had powerful connections even then.
Oh, for sure. Seneca lived there for about 10 crucial years, being nursed back to health. And that period gave him this deep exposure to provincial administration and the wider Roman world.
Which you can see later in his writings on, say, global citizenship.
Definitely. When he returned to Rome in AD 31, he successfully launched his political career.
His aunt's connections must have helped him secure the office of quaestor.
No doubt. Sometime after AD 37. And for those who might not know the Roman political ladder, becoming a quaestor was the crucial first step. It earned him the absolute right to sit and speak in the Senate.
And he was immediately recognized for his exceptional oratory skills. He rose in prominence very quickly.
But in the unstable environment of the imperial court, talent was often a liability, wasn't it?
It really was. His success directly offended the Emperor Caligula.
And this is one of those moments that just shows the sheer, terrifying absurdity of life under the Rulio Claudians.
It's unbelievable. Caligula, known for his volatility, was so put off by Seneca's superior speaking abilities that he ordered Seneca to commit suicide.
It's just chilling. Cassius Dio reports that Seneca was only saved because a woman close to the emperor convinced Caligula that Seneca was already severely ill and would soon die naturally anyway.
So he survived by sheer accident.
An accident. An anecdote he later used to discuss the capricious nature of fortune.
So, Seneca survives Caligula's caprice. He continues his career, only to face a politically manufactured crisis under the next emperor, Claudius.
In AD 41, he was accused of adultery with Julia Livilla, who was Caligula's sister.
But most historians agree this was basically a political hit job, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Orchestrated by the ruthless Empress Messalina, who was trying to eliminate political rivals and their supporters.
The death sentence was initially imposed.
It was. But Claudius, possibly in a rare moment of clemency, commuted the sentence to 8 years of exile on the rugged island of Corsica.
8 years. That is a long time for a prominent, wealthy Roman. And this period is critical because it forces us to confront those hypocrisy charges immediately. He wrote philosophical works, the Consolations, during this time.
He did. We have 2 surviving examples. The Consolation to Helvia, which he addressed to his grieving mother, is generally seen as pretty sincere.
Using Stoic arguments to comfort her, right?
Exactly. But the second one, the Consolation to Polybius, addressed to one of Claudius's powerful freedmen. That's the controversial one.
Why? Because he essentially threw his philosophical pride out the window and begged to come back.
That's it. The work is notorious for its excessive flattery of Claudius, praising his wisdom and clemency, and expressing Seneca's desperate, politically motivated hope for recall.
So if Stoicism is truly about accepting fate and cultivating inner virtue regardless of your circumstances,
then Seneca's actions here, sycophantically courting favor to end his suffering, look like a profound betrayal of his own teachings.
it's a tough look. He also mentions the death of his only son during this period, which adds a layer of personal tragedy to the political disgrace.
Right, from an earlier unconfirmed marriage. But the political maneuvering in the end paid off. His return in AD 49 was orchestrated by the new empress Agrippina, who had married her uncle, Claudius.
Agrippina, a political mastermind with one singular goal, securing the succession for her son.
Her son, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. She secured Seneca's recall, appointed him praetor at higher judicial office, and most critically, appointed him tutor to our 12-year-old son.
The future Emperor Nero.
The very same. This was a calculated move. Seneca brought intellectual weight and moral prestige to Nero's education.
This catapulted him from exiled disgrace to imperial kingmaker. When Nero ascended the throne in AD 54, Seneca transitioned to imperial advisor, partnering with the Praetorian prefect Sextus Afranius Burrus.
And for the next 8 years, these 2 men were the effective rulers of the Roman world.
This period, especially the first 5 years, is often called the Quinquennium Nero.
Yes, and ancient sources generally agree that this early rule was remarkably competent, pragmatic, and humane.
Largely because Nero was being guided by the restraint and administrative skill of Seneca and Burrus.
Seneca wasn't just governing, though. He was also producing political literature.
Including throwing some serious shade at his former patron, Claudius.
Oh, absolutely. Seneca wrote Nero's polished accession speeches, the funeral eulogy for Claudius, and, most famously, the satirical skit Apocalypsintosis,
which translates to the gordification of the divine Claudius.
It brutally mocks Claudius's deification. It portrays him as a bumbling, half-witted godling who was constantly confused and eventually shipped off to the underworld.
It's a work of pure intellectual vengeance. It proves Seneca had sharp political teeth.
But the work that really reveals his attempt to use philosophy for political control is De Clementia, or On Clemency, written in AD 55.
And the timing on this is crucial.
It is. This essay followed Nero's murder of Britannicus, Claudius's legitimate son, and that murder sent shockwaves through the Roman elite.
So De Clementia was basically a public relations piece to assure everyone that the bloodshed was over.
That's likely. While it flatters Nero, it is fundamentally a moral treatise instructing a ruler on the Stoic necessity of clemency. Seneca argues that a ruler's power is most secure and godlike when it's tempered by mercy.
He's teaching that clemency, not cruelty, is the highest virtue for an emperor.
It was his desperate attempt to mold Nero into a Stoic king.
And this attempt at molding Nero was happening at the same time Seneca was accumulating wealth at a terrifying rate. Here is where the philosophical ideal just shatters against political reality. How wealthy did he actually become?
His accumulation of wealth was legendary. Our sources accuse him of amassing a personal fortune of 300 million sesterces in just 4 years.
Okay, let's put that in perspective. What does that even mean?
To give you a rough contemporary equivalent, this would place him among the absolute wealthiest individuals in the entire Roman world. We're likely talking a fortune equivalent to several $billion today.
So he wasn't just wealthy, he was in the 1/10% of the Roman elite.
Easily. And the key charge wasn't just that he was rich, but how he got rich.
The high-interest loans.
The accusation, leveled by his critics, was that he achieved this staggering sum by engaging in massive financial operations, specifically charging extraordinarily high interest rates on loans across Italy and the provinces.
This was high-level speculative finance that just flew in the face of his philosophical commitment to simplicity.
It did. And this immense wealth made him a target. Senator Publius Suilius Rufus, a former favorite of Claudius, launched a very public and scathing attack.
And these attacks were vicious.
They were. Suilius charged Seneca not only with the exorbitant loans, but also with sexual corruption, even suggesting an illicit relationship with Agrippina.
The sexual charges were probably just political mudslinging.
Most likely. But the financial charges resonated because they were easily observable. People could see the wealth.
But Seneca, being the most powerful man in Rome at that moment, handled this criticism brutally, proving his political resolve trumped his stoic calm.
He used his influence immediately. He successfully prosecuted Suilius Rufus for corruption, which was probably true. Corruption was endemic.
Right.
Confiscating half of Suilius's vast estate and sending him into permanent exile.
So Seneca won the political battle, but the charges of hypocrisy cemented themselves in the public mind.
They did. And the ripple effect of Seneca's high-interest loans didn't just affect Roman senators. It reached the fringes of the empire and contributed to one of the most famous revolts in history.
This is the absolutely stunning connection reported by Cassius Dio, the famous Boudica uprising in Britain.
That's right, the revolt that resulted in the destruction of 3 major Roman settlements and the deaths of tens of thousands of Roman citizens and auxiliaries.
Was fueled in part by Seneca's financial aggression.
He had forced massive loans onto the indigenous British aristocracy after Claudius's conquest, and then aggressively and suddenly called them in, demanding immediate repayment.
Wait, hold on. So the philosophical advisor to the emperor, the man who wrote On Clemency, effectively sparked a massive war because of his personal greed.
That's the accusation.
How did he even begin to justify that morally?
Well, he had to justify it. He addressed these very criticisms in his essay De Vita Beata, On the Happy Life.
And his philosophical defense was, what? Classic Stoic maneuvering.
Pretty much. He argued that wealth itself is a preferred indifferent. It's not a good or an evil, but it's something naturally preferred over poverty.
So it's fine to be rich as long as you don't love being rich. Is that the idea?
Precisely. Seneca maintained that a philosopher could properly gain and spend wealth so long as virtue remained intact. The wise man, he claimed, doesn't let wealth control him. He merely uses it as a tool.
And he has to be prepared to lose it without pain.
Exactly. And he must practice poverty regularly to ensure he's not spiritually dependent on it. It's an incredibly convenient, yet highly structured philosophical defense.
Despite winning the PR battle and trying to justify his fortune, his power was rapidly dissolving. The political protection he and Nero's regime relied upon ended in AD 62.
That's right. Praetorian prefect Burrus died in AD 62. And Tacitus captured this moment with chilling conciseness. Mors burri infringit Senecae potentiam.
The death of Burrus broke Seneca's power.
Without his steadfast political partner, Nero's restraints were off. The emperor's darker, more erratic impulses took over.
And Seneca, sensing the shifting tide and the mortal danger, tried to get out.
He tried twice in AD 62 and again in AD 64, offering to return his entire staggering fortune to Nero and retire fully.
But Nero refused both times.
He did, probably because allowing Seneca to retire would have suggested a public admission that Nero no longer trusted his chief advisor.
So Seneca was forced into this kind of semi-retirement.
Right. He increasingly adopted a quiet lifestyle on his country estates, away from the court.
But this forced retreat was a huge gift to philosophy.
It was crucial. During these final years, he focused intensely on writing. He composed the comprehensive scientific Encyclopedia Naturalis Questiones, and most enduringly, the intensely personal and practical letters to Lucilius.
These are the works that defined his lasting legacy, written in the shadow of impending death.
All of this political maneuvering and philosophical contemplation leads, inevitably, to the final dramatic act, the Stoic death.
In AD 65, the Pisonian conspiracy, a major plot to assassinate Nero, was exposed.
And although historians have long debated how much he was actually involved, Seneca was officially implicated.
Either because he was genuinely involved, or, more likely, because Nero used the conspiracy as the perfect excuse to eliminate his now obsolete former tutor.
Regardless of his guilt, the outcome was the same. Nero ordered him to commit suicide.
And Seneca responded with traditional Roman dignity, adhering to the Stoic exit.
He did. Surrounded by friends and family, he severed several veins in his arms and legs to bleed to death. He intended this to be his final, calm, philosophically prepared moment.
But our sources reveal this was not the quick, clean, and dignified death he had prepared for his entire life.
No. This is where philosophical ideal meets biological reality, as you said earlier. Due to his advanced age and possibly his sustained ascetic diet, the blood loss was agonizingly slow. It prolonged the pain.
His body just refused to cooperate with his will.
It did. He tried everything. He took poison, which was also not immediately fatal, and finally immersed himself in a warm bath, hoping the steam would hasten the blood flow. He was ultimately suffocated by the vapor.
A final, painful indignity.
It's a deeply tragic moment. And his younger wife, the Roman noblewoman Pompeia Paulina, attempted to share his fate.
She began to sever her own veins.
She did. However, Nero, perhaps unwilling to face the public outcry over two prominent suicides, ordered her saved. Her wounds were bound, and she survived.
Living out her remaining years, Tacitus notes, with a pale and constant memory of that terrifying day.
And Tacitus's account is the primary source we have, and it's just layered with ambiguity, isn't it?
It really is. On the one hand, Tacitus gives us the romanticized, classic depiction, a calm, philosophically prepared sage offering final words of wisdom to his friends.
But Tacitus is a deeply cynical historian.
He is, and he includes the detail that Seneca left his family only an imago sui vitae, an image of his life.
Which can mean a commemorative death mask. But Tacitus's tone implies that even in death, Seneca was performing, crafting a final, perfect facade for posterity.
Aware that his messy life needed a perfectly clean ending. Okay, now we shift entirely to the body of work that truly secured his place in history. Seneca is not just a secondary source for Stoicism. He is considered a foundational, major philosophical figure.
Yeah, his surviving writings constitute the single largest collection of primary material we have for ancient Stoicism.
That scale is crucial. When we talk about Roman Stoicism, we're really talking about the big three: Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius.
And Seneca's contributions are invaluable because of their sheer volume and, critically, their style.
Very accessible.
Highly accessible. Unlike some of the earlier highly technical Greek philosophical treatises, Seneca's writing is sharp, direct, which is why he became so incredibly popular during the Renaissance. He inspired figures like Montaigne and Erasmus.
I wonder about his technical adherence to the school. Was he just regurgitating Zeno and Chrysippus, or was he synthesizing new ideas?
Well, modern scholarship has definitely shifted its view here. Right. He was once seen as highly eclectic, borrowing freely from all schools. But today, he's largely viewed as a fairly orthodox Stoic, albeit a free-minded one. He built on the classical foundations laid by the founders, Zeno, Cleanthes, Chrysippus, and he showed a keen interest in later Stoics like Posidonius.
But the tension is always there. He frequently quotes Epicurus, the philosophical rival of the Stoics.
That's the free-minded element. He was a pragmatist. Seneca used Epicurus not for his core physics or metaphysics, but purely for ethical maxims, pithy, useful quotes about living well or controlling desire.
So if a rival philosopher provided a good tool for moral improvement, he used it.
He used it. His central ethical framework, however, remains rock-solidly Stoic. Virtue is the sole good, and external matters like health, wealth, or exile are indifferent.
Let's get to the core of that ethical practice. Seneca viewed philosophy as a therapeutic tool, a balm for the wounds of life, focusing entirely on ethical perfection and psychological resilience.
That therapeutic approach is what makes him so relevant today. A central tenet of his work is the absolute necessity of reason in combating what he called destructive passions.
He didn't see emotions like anger and grief as just inconveniences. He saw them as pathological diseases of the mind.
He did, and this is where Martha Nussbaum's analysis comes in, highlighting his surprisingly modern psychological insights.
She noted his profound appreciation of the swift, devastating, and pathological nature of uncontrolled anger.
Yes. In his view, anger is not a useful tool for justice or motivation. It's a temporary madness, a destructive force that has to be uprooted entirely, not just moderated.
He argued that the first motion of anger must be crushed because once it gains momentum, reason can't stop it.
Exactly. And his practical advice is centered on these core themes that resonate with every human experience.
Confronting mortality, for one.
Absolutely. Seneca stresses that we have to consistently contemplate death, not in a morbid way, but as a preparation. If you're prepared to face death, it doesn't arrive as a shock, and you're free to live the present moment fully.
And on the cosmic scale, he constantly emphasizes that the universe is governed for the best by a rational providence, a divine plan.
And therefore, acceptance of adversity and fate is the only reasonable response.
Which brings us back to the biggest philosophical landmine for him, wealth. How did he reconcile preaching poverty while being a multi-billionaire?
We discussed his defense in De Vita Beata, but the key is the practice of poverty. He urged his students, including Lucilius, to practice poverty often.
Wear rough clothes, eat basic food, sleep on a hard bed.
Right. Not because these things are inherently good, but to prove to yourself that your happiness does not depend on comfort or luxury.
This practice ensures that when adversity strikes, when Nero confiscates your wealth, for instance, you remain inwardly impervious because you have mentally rehearsed the loss.
The wealth is merely a convenient tool, not a spiritual requirement.
So if he could lose all 300 million sesterces tomorrow and still be virtuous, then his virtue is intact.
That's the Stoic logic, yes.
Yeah.
His virtue is determined by his internal judgment and his use of the wealth, not the volume of the wealth itself.
He also spent a great deal of time on social virtues like friendship, favors, and clemency.
A theme he desperately hoped Nero would internalize.
He also spent time on that fundamental question of the philosophical life. Should one engage in the active life of politics or the contemplative life of study?
Given his personal journey, a decade in the Senate, 8 years as the chief power broker, then forced retirement and scholarship, this was the central conflict of his adult existence.
Well, what did he conclude?
That both paths are valid. The ethical theory, the contemplative life, and the practical application, the active life, are distinct but interdependent. You study to know what is right, and you apply that knowledge in the public sphere.
Or you retreat when the public sphere is morally corrosive, as it was under Nero.
Exactly.
When we look at the breadth of his prose, it's astonishing how much he produced, especially in those final, pressured years. Let's start with his most personal and enduring collection, the letters to Lucilius.
The Epistulae Moralis ad Lucilium are a collection of 124 letters, often organized into 20 books. They're addressed to Lucilius Jr., a Roman procurator in Sicily, and they are essentially an ongoing diary of Seneca's search for ethical perfection.
They're so intimate, instructional, and highly conversational.
And what's unique about them is that they cover such a vast range of daily moral issues, from how to handle a noisy neighbor to the proper use of time.
He tackles everything that affects the psyche. They document his personal struggles with aging and mortality, with the corruption of Rome.
They really are the ultimate manual for practical daily stoicism.
Then we have the Naturalis Questiones. On the surface, this 7-book encyclopedia detailing cosmology, meteorology, geology. It seems like a massive digression from ethics. Why did the Stoics consider scientific inquiry so vital?
Because for the Stoic, physics understanding the natural world was inseparable from ethics. Seneca believed that by observing the rational, complex, and ordered structure of the cosmos, one could better appreciate the rational providence that governed it.
So if you understand the grand, logical design of the universe, you're better equipped to accept the small adversities of your own life.
Exactly. It confirms his commitment to understanding the whole of reality, not just the moral part.
And his famous dialogues or essays tackle vices and virtues with surgical precision. Let's start with the argument in De Brevitate Vitae on the shortness of life.
This is a profound argument. Seneca forcefully counters the universal human complaint that life is too short. He argues that life isn't short at all. Rather, we waste most of it.
We spend our time anxiously pursuing goals we may never reach, or tending to other people's business.
Or just being spiritually idle. The life we do live wisely, focusing on study and virtue, is always sufficient, regardless of its length.
He's essentially arguing that the man who dies at 80, having never focused on wisdom, has lived a shorter life than the man who dies at 30, but dedicated himself to philosophy.
It's a powerful distinction. It's not about the quantity of time, but the quality of attention.
And then there is Diderot on anger, which we touched on earlier.
De Ira is arguably his most psychologically insightful work. It's a detailed study on the consequences and control of anger. He uses vivid, powerful imagery to portray anger as a temporary but absolute madness that destroys the capacity for reason.
And he provides practical steps, like observing others' anger to see its ugliness or delaying reaction.
To crush the initial impulse before it overtakes a rational mind.
And finally, a work that directly addresses his own turbulent life, De Providentia, on providence.
This essay confronts the problem of evil directly. It addresses the seeming contradiction that if the universe is governed by a rational, benevolent force, providence, why do good people suffer adversity?
What's his answer?
Seneca argues that adversity is not punishment, but training. He famously states that fortune targets the strongest men for the greatest struggles, because only they can bear the weight of those challenges.
So the wise man welcomes adversity as an opportunity to test and strengthen his virtue.
And in doing so, he reconciles fate with rational acceptance.
Okay, now we come to the great contradiction of Seneca's artistic life. The same philosopher who wrote hundreds of thousands of words promoting rational control, peace, and serenity.
Also wrote 10 attributed tragedies that are just saturated with blood, madness, intense rage, and cosmic horror.
It is the ultimate Seneca paradox, and it's why scholars were so confused for so long.
The tragedies are characterized by intense, uncontrolled emotions. They feature characters driven to madness, ruin, and grotesque self-destruction. They appear to be the complete antithesis of everything he preached in his philosophical prose.
So how do we, as modern deep divers, reconcile the Stoic sage with the author of Thyestes, a play where a man is tricked into eating his own children?
The reconciliation lies in function, not form. Scholars generally argue that the play's function is a kind of philosophical case study, a negative lesson.
So they serve to demonstrate, in terrifying and memorable detail, the absolute pathological destruction that occurs when passions like rage, ambition, and jealousy are given free rein.
Exactly. They are a dramatic warning. They show the absolute worst-case scenario.
So the plays are effectively illustrating the consequences of failing to heed the advice in De Ira and De Constantia Sapientis.
That's it. In plays like Medea or Phaedra, the characters are completely consumed by a destructive passion rage or lust, leading them to commit inhuman acts and ultimately ruin themselves.
And fate is presented as a powerful, oppressive cosmic force.
Right, which reinforces the Stoic theme that external events are beyond mortal control, even if the individual's response to those events remains within their control.
There's also the long-standing debate about how these plays were originally presented. Were they staged like modern theater, or were they something else entirely?
The performance debate is crucial. The older consensus held that Seneca's plays were written purely for recitation, essentially dramatic readings in intimate settings.
Maybe because of their extreme violence and elaborate, often static set pieces.
They are highly rhetorical, full of long speeches, suggesting a more literary rather than theatrical function.
But the modern view is shifting, isn't it?
It is. While we lack definitive stage direction evidence, modern productions have proven that they can be successfully staged. The emphasis shifts to the psychological intensity rather than physical action.
Whether they were staged or not, they were certainly written to be heard and witnessed in some dramatic forum.
To create a psychological space for horror and reflection, yes.
Seneca mostly stuck to Greek subjects, drawing on classical mythology.
Yes, these are the Fabulae Crepidei. His masterpiece is almost universally considered to be Thyestes, renowned for its profound sense of cosmic evil and its structural influence on later drama.
Medea and Phaedra are also highly regarded,
showcasing central themes of overwhelming feminine rage and uncontrolled desire, respectively. Other key plays include Hercules, Furens, Troades, Oedipus, and Agamemnon.
However, not every play attributed to him is authentically Senecan.
Correct. Two key attributions are heavily disputed. Hercules Aeneas is generally considered not Seneca's work, likely written by a talented imitator.
And the most famous disputed work is Octavia.
Right. And Octavia is interesting because it's a fabula praetexta, which means it breaks the Greek mold.
It's a tragedy set in a Roman, not Greek, context.
Precisely. Usually dealing with historical or mythological figures from Roman history. Octavia features Seneca himself as a character, lamenting the moral downfall of Nero and the tragic fate of Nero's first wife, Octavia.
And the reason we know it's almost certainly not by Seneca.
It contains incredibly accurate, detailed prophecies of both Seneca's forced suicide and, critically, Nero's eventual downfall and death.
And given that Seneca died in AD 65 and Nero in AD 68.
The consensus is that the play must have been written later, perhaps under the Flavian dynasty, by someone who was intimately familiar with the ultimate historical outcomes and eager to frame Seneca in a heroic, victimized light.
Whether they were acted or read in classrooms, the influence of these dark rhetorical plays is immense, creating what we call the Senecan tradition.
The footprint of Seneca's tragedy is enormous. His plays became canonical reading material in medieval and Renaissance universities. They were essential texts that shaped the literary landscape of Europe for centuries.
And he directly influenced the development of tragic drama in Elizabethan England, didn't he?
Absolutely. We see Seneca's influence all over the great tragic playwrights, including Shakespeare.
The themes of elaborate rhetorical revenge, the use of ghosts and supernatural portents.
The pervasive internal anguish expressed in lengthy monologues, these are all hallmarks that trace back to Seneca's dramatic style.
And his influence also extended into continental Europe,
profoundly shaping the works of French classicists like Corneille and Racine and the Dutch playwright Vondel.
But his most direct and specific contribution was arguably inspiring an entire dominant genre, revenge tragedy.
This is key. He is regarded as the source and inspiration for the entire genre of revenge tragedy, which truly took off in the late Elizabethan and Jacobean eras.
It arguably begins with Thomas Kyd's wildly popular The Spanish Tragedy.
It does. Kyd adopted the Senecan elements of the revenge-seeking ghost, the intense use of soliloquy, and the focus on the agonizing, often bloody, moral calculus required for vengeance.
So Seneca's influence turned tragedy into a vehicle for spectacular moral and psychological investigation.
Exactly.
Seneca's physical life ended in AD 65, but his afterlife in Western thought is perhaps even more dramatic than his tragedies.
It really is. Even 30 years after his death, his writings were hugely popular. But the truly fascinating development is how the early Christian church embraced a pagan philosopher who was a political killer and a multimillionaire.
How did that even happen?
The early Christian church was remarkably favorably disposed toward him. They looked at his moral essays, his dedication to virtue, and his advocacy for principles like mercy and moderation, and they saw a kindred spirit.
The church leader Tertullian referred to him possessively as our Seneca,
which is a sign of profound intellectual ownership, and this admiration led to an extraordinary historical forgery.
complete letters.
By the 4th century, an unauthentic correspondence between Seneca and Paul the Apostle was created and widely circulated. This completely cemented his reputation in the nascent Christian tradition.
The belief was that Seneca had corresponded with Paul while Paul was imprisoned in Rome,
suggesting a direct Christian influence on the philosopher's later works.
And these forged letters were taken seriously by giants of the church.
Absolutely. St. Jerome and St. Augustine both mentioned Seneca as if he were a Christian writer, lending tremendous authority to the belief.
And this influence continued throughout the Middle Ages.
It did. The 13th century Golden Legend, a hugely popular collection of saints' lives, even included his death scene, depicting it as a virtuous martyrdom.
This allowed Seneca an honorary status among the great thinkers. Dante, for instance, placed him alongside Cicero in the first circle of hell, or limbo.
And Boccaccio went even further, hinting that Seneca's forced suicide was a form of disguised baptism. This legacy of Seneca the Christian provided critical protection for his work for centuries.
It ensured his texts survived and remained central to European education.
But despite that medieval saint status, the shadow of hypocrisy never truly lifted. The stock criticism of Seneca right down the centuries remains the contrast between the purity of his philosophical teachings and the highly questionable reality of his personal practice.
The critics have always had powerful evidence.
They do. They point to the consolation to Polybius during his exile, a complete abandonment of Stoic acceptance of fate in favor of desperate political flattery.
They cite his merciless ridicule of Claudius in the Apocolocyntosis right after Claudius's death, while simultaneously writing flattering, instructive works to Nero.
And of course, the 300 billion sesterces. That's the charge that is impossible to ignore.
It's the elephant in the villa. How can a man who preaches the virtue of poverty run a predatory lending operation that contributed to one of the largest uprisings in Roman Britain?
Critics argue that his life proved that his philosophy was merely rhetorical window dressing for ruthless political ambition.
And this criticism was weaponized during the Renaissance, long after the Christian protection started to wane.
Most famously in the 16th century, the physician and mathematician Girolamo Cardano wrote a scathing apology that praised Nero, a figure almost universally condemned.
And at the same time portrayed Seneca as a crook of the worst kind.
An empty rhetorician, only interested in money and power. Cardano argued Seneca fully deserved the death he received.
So this controversy over Seneca's character is central to his reception, not just a historical footnote.
It is.
So how has modern scholarship responded to this stock criticism? Is it fair to judge him solely on the basis of a vengeful Roman senator's accusations?
Well, modern scholars have worked hard toward a rehabilitation, primarily by challenging the sources. Anna Lydia Motto in 1966 made a very powerful argument.
What was her argument?
That the entirely negative image of Seneca relies almost exclusively on the biased, partisan account of Publius Suilius Rufus, the man Seneca exiled. She noted that relying on that source alone is like judging Socrates solely by the satirical caricature provided by the comic playwright Aristophanes.
That reframing changes everything. It asks us to question the reliability of the accuser, not just the accused.
And recent scholarship has moved beyond just source criticism. It emphasizes Seneca's originality. He wasn't just a conduit for Greek ideas. He was an innovator in the practical application of ethics and, especially, in the psychological analysis of human behavior.
Which brings us back to his relevance today, particularly in psychology and emotion.
Martha Nussbaum's work is indispensable here. She explored Seneca's crucial contribution to the psychology of emotions, highlighting his deep, almost clinical insights on desire, grief, and anger management.
His understanding of anger as a sudden, brief madness that blinds reason is incredibly resonant with modern cognitive approaches to emotional regulation.
He provided a practical path to emotional resilience that is still entirely applicable today.
And his influence extends into broader social and political philosophy.
Absolutely. Nussbaum found profound richness in his political philosophy, his thoughts on education, his advocacy for mercy, his concept of global citizenship. She proposed that modern reform-minded education could be based on his ideas,
arguing that he provides a thoughtful basis for looking beyond narrow nationalism toward a more universal human community.
Right. And finally, one surprising area where Seneca is noted as a key original thinker is gratitude.
Gratitude.
His work De Beneficiis, or On Benefits, is a cornerstone of this discussion. Seneca was the first great Western thinker to truly dissect the complex nature and social role of gratitude.
He explored the reciprocal duty of giving and receiving favors,
emphasizing that true generosity comes without expectation of return, and that ingratitude is one of the most destructive forces in human relationships. This focus on social debt and moral obligation elevates his ethical thought far beyond mere self-help.
His complex life still holds massive cultural power, proving his story is far from over.
We see him continually portrayed in media, from Monteverdi's 1642 opera L'Incarnazione di Poppea, which, interestingly, was based on the non-Senecan Octavia,
showcasing the enduring power of his dramatic style,
to recent films focusing specifically on his final dramatic days under Nero. The paradox of the philosopher-millionaire advisor continues to captivate.
So we've spent a substantial amount of time today unpacking the life of Seneca, a man defined by contradiction.
He was the architect of practical, accessible Stoic ethics, documenting for us how to confront mortality and systematically manage our destructive passions.
Yet this sage lived a life of ruthless, high-stakes political intrigue, amassed a staggeringly enormous and ethically questionable fortune, and authored grim, passionate tragedies that seemed to warn against the very life he was living.
He was, fundamentally, a man who preached poverty and inner indifference from the height of imperial power.
And despite that overwhelming paradox, his legacy survived the fall of Rome by being revered as a proto-Christian saint.
And his insights on resilience, anger, and the proper use of time continue to inform modern ethical and psychological thought.
Seneca spent his life preparing his mind for the inevitable, dignified Stoic exit. He severed his veins, he gave his final instructions, and he attempted to leave the world with philosophical resolve. But his body, weakened by age and his diet, refused to obey the philosophical ideal, drawing out his death into a prolonged, painful, and messy affair. What stands out to you, our learner, about the moment when the highest philosophical resolve meets the stubborn, messy reality of biological failure? It reminds us that while we can control our judgments, the body and the physical world remain profoundly indifferent to even the wisest intentions.